Ben is going to talk about can bureaucracy understand ecological agriculture? So a little bit of a change in title. He's been thinking a lot about different definitions of alternative agriculture. Ben is a PhD candidate in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at UVM, as well as a Gund Graduate Fellow at the Gund Institute for Environment. And he is part of our economic he's working a lot on food systems transformation questions. It's a great way to end our webinar today, particularly on the production side of the system. And he's going to talk to us about that work. Ben, take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I've kind of been in a hole like a lot of people recently, just kind of squirreling away on work, and I wasn't sure exactly what to share. But I think actually some of this fits really well in ways that I can't quite articulate with the previous two talks. So I'm excited to, maybe we'll figure out what those connections are in the next 15 minutes or in the conversation afterwards. So this talk right now is called Can Bureaucracy Understand Ecological Agriculture? And I think that that's a really important question. And so how I'm starting with thinking, I think about this a lot, or one of the important elements of this is the historian James Scott talks about this idea of bureaucratic legibility. So there are systems that are easier for bureaucrats or people from afar to understand. And so this is, I actually don't know where this stock photo is, but this is like an example of a city that emerges organically. And this is a picture of Brasilia, which is a city that was designed from the top down. And a lot of his argument in Seeing Like a State, one of his books, is about the idea that actually the city on the left functions better from a human perspective than the city on the right, for reasons that are very well connected to how the city on the right looks more orderly. And of course, he actually draws this from an ecological metaphor that the forest or the plantation on the right here is obviously much easier to understand for us. It's much easier to quantify. It's we can count the number of trees. They're all the same species. We can just go out and understand it in a very simple way, versus an actual forest is much harder to understand and manage for somebody who's not, to make a connection with Joe, sort of embedded within the system. And so the connection that I've been thinking a lot about in agriculture is we can take a look at two different farming systems. You have a field of corn, or you have a multi-strata agroforest. It's much easier for a person who is not embedded in the system, somebody who is maybe a researcher, maybe a policymaker, maybe a consumer, just sort of anybody who's not the farmer themselves. It's much easier to understand and sort of quantify and make generalizations about this cornfield on the right than it is about this one right here. And that causes a lot of problems, because a lot of what we know is, and we have sort of really strong reasons to believe is better in ecological agriculture, is systems that look more like this one. So this one is harder to go about understanding and harder to make sense of from that disembedded view, but it's also probably better. And this gets to some problems, like as bureaucrats are sort of this view from outside. We have these tools of, we might be subsidizing a better form of agriculture. We might be certifying it. We might have a university that wants to spend a certain amount of its food purchasing from a certain type of agriculture. So we need to understand it. We need to put bounds around it to do that. If we're really trying to do meta-analysis and scenario and assessments, we have to say, well, is X type of system better than Y type of system? Well, we need boundaries around X and Y. And also, if we are going out and trying to support a new form of agriculture, we have to actually define it to know whether we're getting it, whether are people actually picking up on our desire to, our encouragements to promote the system. So once again, these more intensified, simplified systems like the cornfield on the right are easier to categorize, they're easier to study, they're easier to build models of, and therefore they're easier to sort of do any type of thing that we might want to do in terms of policy or top-down collective action, sort of broadly speaking. It's just easier to do it on the simpler system. It's easier to regulate it. It's easier to incentivize different practices within it. It's easier to verify and certify. And so my favorite example of this, I have had this slide for a while, which I stole from another researcher credited at the bottom, is this idea of silvopasture. If you go on, for instance, the website Drawdown, which talks about climate solutions, silvopasture is like, I think, in the top 10, which is when you carefully manage integrations of pasture, livestock, and trees. Obviously, like, you can have more trees and you have more carbon sequestration. You can have better soil health. Your animals can be healthier. And so well-managed silvopasture is a best management practice, as they say in the business. A wooded livestock paddock, which is where you put animals in the woods, is a worst management practice. And there's a whole sort of set of, it's basically one of the worst things that you can do in agriculture is just let a bunch of animals run around in the woods. And while going on the ground, like, you can tell the difference between the system on the right and the system on the left here. However, that's not the easiest type of thing to distinguish between from a view from afar. And that's one reason that traditionally extensionists are actually especially who've worked in forestry, they just sort of hate this idea of silvopasture because they say, I spent my whole life telling people to not put their cows in the woods, and now you're telling me we need to put our cows in the woods, but we need to do it, and we need to communicate in the right way, and we need to, like, communicate a lot of subtleties around it. And just broadly, environmental policy draws us to see agriculture in this way. This is a figure from a project that I'm working on with John, and I'm not really talking about today. But this idea that you have all these little fields, and we can quantify them, and we're looking at it from above. But and then part of that is the scale of the problems, right? We're talking about watershed, regional, or global problems, and a lot of these are these classic environmental externalities where farmers are impacted very little by their own pollution, compared to the collective problems, and the small differences, an extra pound of phosphorus lost off of a field in Vermont, which is sort of insignificant to the farmer. If that's done on every field, that is a eutrophied lake in Vermont, for instance. But so we want to view agriculture like this, or at least our policy tools want us to view it like this. But agroecology, ecology, and I would say justice draws us towards the unique and the individual. So it's not just you have this category of agroforestry system, you have 4 completely unique agroforestry systems that are maybe not comparable with one another, and you maybe can't generalize about the same way that you might be able to generalize about cornfields. So 2 little stories to tell about this, thinking about organic agriculture and sort of, you might even say, what went wrong with organics, and then talking also about integrated pest management and different approaches that bureaucracies take to understanding that as a philosophy. So basically, to really summarize, I have a whole paper I'm working on this. Organic agriculture goes from the organic view of farming, which is sort of organic as holism. So that's the meaning of the word organic in the first part of the 20th century, was as like an organism, so having many moving parts within it that all collaborate in different ways, just like I have a heart and lungs and a stomach, and they all need each other. A farm has soils and animals and crops and wildlife on it, and they all are working together. And so it was primarily brought up as a different way of thinking about farming systems, more so than an actual set of rules. There were enormous disagreements among people in the organic movement about sort of what organic agriculture was. As late as the 1950s, you had people, sending out in the organic newsletters like, now we know that some of you think that DDT is great, but we're thinking that it's not great. So it wasn't as it is today, sort of a set of practices that were well defined. It also wasn't a political view, because early organics was a eclectic mix of sort of pseudo-fascists and socialists and kind of everything in between. Later on in the 20th century, you have the idea of like really politics and movement politics being the center of organic, because of pesticide scares like the DDT scare. This combination of anti-war politics that really undermined a lot of faith in institutions. So it gets tied up anti-war, anti-nuclear, and back to the land movements. And it's really about this idea that big business is taking over big science, is taking over big government, and that is really bad for the way that the food system is organized. And then over time, it evolves again, especially as you've built a movement of people who really believe in a different idea of what food and farming should be. It becomes a set of farming systems, and it becomes sort of increasingly viewed through the lens of organic is just a set of farming systems, that every farm in the world either is or isn't an organic farm, and we can create policies that can allow us to neatly divide all farms into that. And I like to map this onto a very famous framework in agroecology, which is the idea that it's a science, a movement, and a practice. So organic goes from primarily being a way of looking at farming systems to primarily a distinct critique of how food systems and the actors within them are organized, to primarily a distinct way of farming. And what ends up happening is that you end up with a one-size-fits-all definition for an agricultural approach that's supposed to be complex and locally situated, like the example of the agroforestry systems before. And you get in all these, you'd see numerous conflicts around the exact details of certification. And in some of those cases, there sort of is a clear right answer. There's a case of corporate capture, and this is what corporations want to do. But a lot of them, there just aren't, because it's at least under the old view, it's a philosophical system, and different people in different places might have different views of like what really makes a system holistic and ecological. And you have this loss of control by movement groups. So on another piece on certification, this idea of integrated pest management, which is a framework that's used to reduce pesticide use on farms, and for some, maybe a way to move towards eliminating it while still growing a lot of food. And it's interesting because I choose integrated pest management because it's a reformist approach to improving farming systems. It's not one of the more radical ones, and it has very wide purchase. Sort of people all over the world, tons of different groups, all say integrated pest management is great. It's the way to go. This is what we need to do. But it's a framework for designing and planning systems that uses ecology among other things. It's not a system. It's kind of at the higher level right there. And because it's a distinctly reformist approach, we know that it's used a lot in certifications. And so I have a sample of a bunch of different certifications that all say, we're trying to get farmers to use integrated pest management as part of our framework. And so I have 4 types. You have regional within the US single commodity certifications. So there's one called Northeast Eco Apple that several orchards in Vermont use. There's domestic multi commodity. Organic would qualify as that for this study because it's mostly sales in the United States, even though it's done globally. But it doesn't because organic doesn't incorporate integrated pest management. Then you have the Global South or low income multi-commodity certifications like fair trade. And then you could also have a Global South single commodity one. There are other possible combinations that just don't exist in my sample. And so you can see that you have among the single commodity certifications that those are the commodities that are covered. And we have ones that are primarily based on just strict requirements, ones that are based on primarily scorecards, so just adding up points, and you have some that are much more a mixture of those two. And so some results, these are kind of preliminary results. I think they're interesting. And so you can see that you have the 4 bins right here. Hatches mean that something is scorecard or improvement, whereas if it's full color, it is something that's just mandated. And one of the things that you can see is where you have a regional 1 commodity certification, there's far more done about talking about how you monitor pests, which is a really important part of managing them. Is just understanding how many you have. Do you have too many? Are more coming or less? And so you can see that that's a big part of these regional 1 commodity certifications, but not part of a lot of the other ones, which makes sense because if you're talking about apples in the Northeast, you can actually have an exhaustive list of these are all of the pests that attack apples in the Northeast in a way that you couldn't say for any type of food that you are growing in the continents of South America and Africa, right? You could not be nearly as kind of complete in discussing that. And you can also see that all of them use some kind of requirements or scorecards around record keeping, monitoring, planning, and education. And another way that those regional 1 commodity certifications are different is that they have a lot more sort of specific things that you're supposed to do, or maybe that you're encouraged to do through a scorecard. So practices around how you spray pesticides, or how you do cultural controls, agronomic practices, and a lot about biosecurity, how you don't create the next invasive superweed or super pest. And so another piece on this is the certification structures, how they're different. So what percentage of their criteria are in these different bins? And you can see that requirements are much more common in these certifications that are focused on low-income countries. Whereas there's a lot more of these scorecard improvement types where you have to, get a 75 out of this total list of kind of choose your own adventure. Much more common in wealthier countries, or in the United States samples. And then, so this is kind of an obvious finding, but it's one that I think is really well illustrated here, that certification is like replacing laws in low-income countries. So you can see the, I feel like I didn't describe this, all these charts are the number of different types of criteria that are used on the left axis, on the y-axis. So you can see that all these certifications that are primarily for low-income countries have a lot more requirements around worker safety and materials and waste management, because a lot of those countries where that's happening might have much less strict labor laws and worker safety laws. So a lot of these could simply be your workers have to have protective equipment when they're handling pesticides. So what I see is that basically the high specificity requirements that are really about what exactly is going on this farm are found in certifications that have really limited scope, both in terms of geography and their commodities. And the kind of ones that you find everywhere is kind of stuff that doesn't actually have to do with what is happening in the farming system. It's things like education, planning, and record keeping, which are important, but that's kind of at a higher up level than sort of what are you doing on this farm? Are you spraying? Are you not? Are you controlling using by promoting beneficial insects, et cetera, et cetera. So what can we learn from this? So it's just fundamentally different to talk about applying this framework in one place at one time versus doing it in general at any place around the world. So if we're looking to make a definition that a bureaucrat can use for agroecology, for instance, it may only be really possible to do that on small spatial scales, and it might sort of demonstrate why this idea of harmonizing organics from a lot of different definitions that were used in specific communities of farms into one just turned out not so great. And sort of the thought of whether we can regulate agriculture based on local standards that are specific, that can be kind of brought together in networks of trust. So thanks so much.